and welcome everyone to another IGS Global Seminar Series. And today we're happy to have Chloe Beam, a postdoc at Alfred Wegener Institute. For those of you who are just joining or maybe have not been to an IGS Global Seminar Series before, this is roughly this is a single seminar about maybe 45-minute talk or however long Chloe prepares to present for. And then we have the rest of the session as a Q&A at the end. If you have questions during the talk, please feel free to use the chat. And that's about it for the housekeeping rules. And without further ado, I'll let Chloe take it away.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for the introduction and yeah, thanks for letting me talk today join your global seminar series. It's been fun to listen to some of the talks over the last few weeks, and I'm glad to be able to speak today. So yeah, I'm Chloe. I'm a new postdoc at Avi. I just started last month, and so I did my PhD. I came from Colorado State University where I did my PhD, and so the work I'm going to be talking about today is on my PhD work that I did over the last few years at CSU. So this is done in collaboration with my supervisor at CSU, Dave Thompson, and then also our collaborator at the University of Washington, Ed Blanchard-Wigglesworth. And the title here I have is about the key role of the southern annular mode on Antarctic sea ice in kind of its recent loss. Since I have the full hour, I'm going to actually revise this title and make it a little bit more general and kind of talk about an additional project I did during my PhD. And so that was looking at sort of also the reverse of what are the impacts of some of this Antarctic sea ice loss on the local atmospheric circulation. And so we're going to kind of look at both sides of the coin here today. And so I like to kind of just start off with a photo at the beginning of talks. I think it's nice to this is a photo of sea ice. I believe it's from the NSIDC. And I think it is just nice to kind of see what we're talking about today and kind of get a visual of what our subject is. And then, so we're interested in sea ice, and it's quite an integral part of the climate system. It mediates heat exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. This little diagram here is kind of showing in the top is kind of conditions associated with a high sea ice state versus conditions with a low sea ice state on the bottom. So with less sea ice, you get more heat from going from the ocean into the atmosphere. Sea ice also impacts ocean circulation via changes in salinity and temperature. So this is kind of just highlighting how changes in formation of circumpolar deep water and bottom water are impacted by how much sea ice is present. Sea ice is also, of course, important for local ecosystems, provides the habitat for, at least in the Antarctic, for penguins, for example, and other members of the local ecosystems. And then also, although sea ice melt obviously doesn't impact sea level rise itself, it impacts ice. It kind of provides a buffer against ice shelves and can prevent or impact ice shelf melt, which then can in turn impact ice sheet melt or ice sheet change that can then impact sea level rise. And so just to kind of run through a couple metrics that we're going to talk about for reporting sea ice, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So sea ice concentration is talked about, and it's the fraction of each grid cell that's covered in sea ice. And so this little schematic below here, kind of each little box I've drawn is, we're going to call it a different grid cell, and I've given it a percentage of sea ice cover. And so this would be how you'd show a map of sea ice concentration, was each little grid box of sea ice showing a percentage or a fraction that's covered. Sea ice extent is kind of a way that we can talk about the spatial average of the amount of sea ice in a given area. And so this would be the total area covered by at least 15% sea ice concentration. This threshold can move around a little bit, but we're going to call it about 15% sea ice concentration today. And so this would be taking all of the boxes that have at least 15% coverage and counting basically all of the boxes here and calculating the area of all of those boxes. So in this little toy diagram here, that would be our sea ice extent would be about 12 kilometers squared. And this is different than sea ice area, which is the total area covered by sea ice. And so this would be now taking into account what the actual percentages of sea ice coverage for each of these little grid boxes is and multiplying it by the area. So then when you add it all up, your sea ice area, for example, here is 7.92. It's a more maybe accurate representation of the total sea ice coverage, taking into account the actual concentrations. And so your sea ice extent is always going to be bigger than your sea ice area because you're inherently not taking into account the exact concentrations. And so we're going to be talking about the Antarctic today. And it's obviously sea ice exists on both poles. They're relatively different environments. In the Antarctic, of course, sea ice is surrounded by ocean versus in the Arctic, sea ice is surrounded by land. And I think it's really interesting how kind of these two very different environments kind of results in different behaviors of sea ice and the ways that it interacts with the rest of the cryosphere and the climate system. Antarctic sea ice, since it's surrounded by ocean, is kind of it's able to have in some ways this very large seasonal cycle. Its seasonal cycle is almost double the seasonal cycle of Arctic sea ice. So this little line plot on the right here is of sea ice area for the Antarctic, and it's just showing that the sea ice maximum occurs in September, the sea ice minimum occurs in February, and kind of highlights how big of the seasonal cycle we do have. The spatial representation of sea ice during September and February is shown on the right. So you can see that sea ice expands quite widely into the Southern Ocean during the sea ice maximum, but then it melts out and ends up very close to the continent during February during the sea ice minimum. And so a lot of the sea ice is kind of first year sea ice that's growing and melting each year. And so the Antarctic and the Arctic have experienced very different trends across the observational period. And so this time series here is showing the time series of sea ice for the Antarctic in blue and the Arctic in black from 1979 until I think 2024. And so you can see that across the observational period, Arctic sea ice has had this kind of consistent decline across the whole time, versus Antarctic sea ice was actually seen kind of this positive trend up until about 2014, and then had this very rapid decline over the last decade or so, a very rapid sudden change in its trend. And so there's been a lot of work done on trying to understand kind of both the positive trend and the negative trend. And kind of both of these projects I'm going to talk about today are kind of trying to explore, kind of the causes and implications of these big changes in Antarctic sea ice. And so as I mentioned, I'm going to kind of talk about two projects today. So the first one is what the original title was kind of about, which is how can atmospheric circulation impact sea ice variability? And so this is primarily focused on what kind of the role of the southern annular mode is in impacting Antarctic sea ice loss and what that relationship looks like. And then the second part is kind of then how can some of this Antarctic sea ice loss, especially over the last decade, be impacting atmospheric circulation and looking at in particular, and can we look at that in observational products, and then also just looking at it on a very local scale. So to start with the first part, so I'm going to first jump back to this kind of time series, and again, kind of draw your attention to the last decade, where we see these very large, unprecedented decline over the last decade, these very large changes that suddenly occurred in the Antarctic and in Antarctic sea ice. And as I mentioned, there's been a lot of work done trying to understand these changes. Folks have looked at how increases in upper ocean heat content could be impacting that. That's what this figure on the bottom is from, a figure from Perch and Doddridge's paper in 2023. That's just showing upper ocean temperature anomalies in the Southern Ocean, and how basically as you move through time, we're moving from negative colder temperature anomalies to warm temperature anomalies that aligns very well with those really big sea ice anomalies that we saw over the last decade. Folks have also looked at teleconnections to tropical climate variability, and then also what we're going to talk more about today, which is atmospheric anomalies, such as impacts of zonal wave number 3 pattern and the southern annular mode. And so a lot of the work, especially in the southern annular mode, has been primarily focused on the austral summer season. And so part of what we were interested in exploring a bit more in this work was what is the seasonality of the relationship between the SAM and sea ice? And kind of what is that? Is there a seasonality to the relationship? And so generally, I guess our question is, what is the role of the southern annular mode in driving some of these recent Antarctic sea ice anomalies? And as I mentioned, how does this relationship vary by season? And then also by lag, how could the SAM in 1 month, maybe does it have an impact on sea ice 6 to 8 months later? Can we kind of look at those sorts of relationships? So just to provide a quick primer on the SAM, if you're not familiar, so it's kind of the leading mode of large-scale atmospheric variability in the southern hemisphere. It's characterized by these north-south oscillations of atmospheric mass between high latitudes and mid latitudes in the southern hemisphere. In its positive phase, it's characterized by positive westerly wind anomalies that are centered at around 60 degrees south, which is kind of shown by that figure on the left. And then that also is characterized by negative pressure anomalies at high latitudes. So in a positive phase, you get anomalously strong westerlies of around 60 degrees south and anomalously low pressure at high latitudes. In the negative phase of the SAM, you just would get the reverse with anomalously weaker winds, westerlies, and high pressure over the high latitudes. For data and methods for this project, we're primarily using observationally constrained data. So sea ice concentration data from the National Snow and Ice Data Center, some wind data from ERA5, sea surface temperature data from HAD ISST, fluxes from series EBAF, and then our SAM indices came from the NOAA Climate Prediction Center, which they were computed from EOF analysis from 700 hectopascal height anomalies from reanalysis. And so all this data is monthly and covers the period from January 1979 until July of 2024. And so as I mentioned, some of the previous work looking at the relationship between the SAM and sea ice had focused on the summer season. And so we first wanted to look at what does the relationship look like during the sea ice maximum season, during the winter. And so what I'm showing here is the regression of September 10-meter winds in the vectors and October sea ice concentration in the shading regressed onto the September SAM. And so what we see, at least with the wind vectors to start, is that they're dominated by this zonally symmetric pattern of enhanced westerlies given a positive September SAM, which is what we would expect. But there are definitely a few areas where those vectors are more zonally asymmetric, where it kind of diverges from this pattern. And I've kind of pointed them out here. And in those couple of regions, we see that the arrows are a little bit more pointed towards the continent. And then those SIM areas are where we see actually negative sea ice anomalies associated with the September SAM. And so that's kind of the red here are negative sea ice anomalies. And so that kind of indicates that maybe this change in these couple areas and where the wind pattern has become zonally asymmetric in September, that could be resulting in some sea ice infection or maybe transport of warmer air from lower latitudes to high latitudes that are resulting in these negative sea ice anomalies given a positive September SAM. And so as I mentioned, we wanted to look at this relationship as a function of lag. And so what I show here on the left is the exact same plot that we were looking at before, but now we're regressing a couple other months of sea ice all onto just the September SAM. And so what we see is that those same areas that had the negative sea ice anomalies in September also have negative sea ice anomalies. And those negative sea ice anomalies are able to persist for up to 6 months later. And those locations stay generally similar. They, of course, contract as the sea ice pack declines, but generally those locations remain, and that a change in the September SAM is potentially able to impact sea ice 6 months later. We can kind of summarize sort of these results by taking an area average of these shaded regressions. And that's sort of what I'm showing in that bar above. And I'll show you the numbers for that in a moment. But basically what the bar above is showing that is different months of sea ice area now regressed onto just the September SAM. And so I've kind of indicated that which months are shown in that bar, and red is indicating negative sea ice area anomalies given a positive September SAM. And the reason we want to kind of show the results like this is because now we can do the same regressions, but for all the other months of the SAM. And so each row here is a different month of SAM that we're regressing onto, and each column is a different lag, so a different month of sea ice that we're regressing onto that particular month of the SAM. And so I just showed you the September row. It shows, again, we're getting these negative sea ice anomalies as a result of a positive September SAM. But now you can see kind of across all the other months, what does this relationship look like? And we see that there's two kind of distinct relationships here. There's one relationship during the sea ice minimum season, and the seasonal cycle of sea ice is just on the right there for reference. So there's one relationship during the sea ice minimum season, and that's a positive relationship. So given a positive anomaly in the SAM, we'd expect a positive anomaly in sea ice area. And there's a negative relationship then during the sea ice maximum season, where given a positive anomaly in the SAM, you'd expect negative sea ice anomalies. And so this is quite a distinct difference between these two relationships. And then there's also a difference in the persistence of these relationships, where the relationship during the sea ice minimum season is maybe only able to persist for 4 to 5 months later, versus the relationship during the sea ice maximum season is able to persist for potentially up to the rest of the following year. So that changes in the sea ice maximum season of the SAM are able to impact sea ice for quite a bit longer than maybe changes in the SAM during the sea ice minimum season would be able to. And so we kind of wanted to, again, investigate the sea ice maximum season a bit more. This is kind of a bit interesting to us. And so we first start off this figure here is exactly what we were just looking at before, as sea ice regressed onto the September SAM. And now we're just going to use it to compare to regressions of clear sky shortwave radiation regressed onto the September SAM. And so these are the same months here on the bottom row, but now we're looking at, again, clear sky shortwave radiation regressed onto the September SAM. And so what we see basically is that those same red areas that we see on the top, especially in November and January, of where you had negative sea ice anomalies, are also where you're getting more shortwave fluxes going into the ocean. And so this is generally to be expected. As you lose sea ice, you of course should get more that shortwave being deposited into the ocean. But I think it's nice to see that you do get those. You do get the shortwave fluxes to line up nicely with the sea ice anomalies, and that it kind of indicates that the timing of when these SAM anomalies are occurring is important, because you need you need that sunlight, you need that excess shortwave radiation into the ocean to kind of provide the conditions for persistent negative sea ice anomalies. And so kind of, I guess this is sort of a way to summarize that point, which is that given a positive anomaly, SAM anomaly in September, you get these negative sea ice anomalies that you get an increased shortwave fluxes into the surface, and that results in increased upper ocean temperatures, which kind of results in the conditions that you're able to get these persistent negative sea ice anomalies for longer out than maybe, say, SAM anomalies that would occur in February or March. Another way to kind of highlight the relative difference of different months, the relative impact of different months of the SAM on the following year of sea ice is this bar graph here. So each bar here is a different month of the SAM that we're regressing the following year of sea ice onto. So for example, the September bar there is September to the following August annual mean sea ice regressed onto the September SAM, versus the February bar there, for example, would be February until the following January sea ice regressed onto the February SAM. And so this is just a way to look at, how much does each month of the SAM impact the following year of sea ice? And so what we see is that September does have this sort of outsized impact on the following year of sea ice, and where it's able to have substantially more of an impact than, say, especially the months during kind of the sea ice minimum season. And so these are just showing regression coefficients here in this bar plot. But if you made the same bar plot, but you instead calculated the variance explained, you'd see that variations in the SAM during September explain over 30% of the annual mean variance in sea ice area, which is a pretty considerable portion. And then finally, kind of for this part, so as I mentioned, kind of the whole kind of goal of this project was trying to understand some of these recent sea ice anomalies. And so I wanted to kind of bring it back to that point. And basically how we looked at that more was we plotted time series of sea ice and SAM and kind of saw how the lines covaried together. And so for each of the rows here, the gray line is exactly the same for each row. And it is the inverted September values of the SAM. And we inverted them just because we had established this negative relationship with sea ice. And then the black lines are different for each month. And they are a different month of sea ice area, with the months indicated on the right side of the plot there. And so what we see, especially if we look at the last decade or so, is that these lines covary quite well together, and that kind of the sea ice and the SAM, the changes in sea ice that you get are tracked with these large variations in the September SAM. And this is true not only for September sea ice, but of course for later months of the year as well, which kind of indicates to us that this relationship could be important for maybe explaining some of these recent anomalies in Antarctic sea ice. And so to kind of just wrap up this piece here, so we've shown that there's this distinct seasonality to the relationship between sea ice area and the SAM. We have this relationship during the sea ice minimum season and a different relationship during the sea ice maximum season. The relationship during the sea ice maximum season has this large persistence. That means that a change in the SAM during September, for example, is able to impact sea ice throughout perhaps the rest of the following year, and that perhaps this relationship can kind of help explain some of these recent sea ice anomalies. So I'm just going to grab a quick sip of water. And so now move on to the second part, which this part, as I mentioned, was exploring how much can some of these sea ice anomalies, the recent sea ice loss, impact the atmospheric circulation, and how can we kind of use observational tools to explore this question a bit more. So I'm going to come back to this time series here, which again, now we've all seen several times, but I think it's always worthwhile to come back and appreciate the differences. Where you see Antarctic sea ice has had kind of this consistent decline across the observational period, versus Antarctic sea ice, of course, has had quite a different story. And so there's been a large body of literature dedicated to understanding kind of the implications of Arctic sea ice decline over the observational period. I've listed just a couple of studies. There's many, many more that have looked at maybe what local impacts are in temperature and precipitation, and if there are remote impacts potentially on mid-latitude atmospheric circulation. And so there's been comparatively fewer studies focused on the Antarctic, perhaps because these recent changes have only occurred in the last decade or so. This is highlighting one study here by Simon Josie et al. In 2024 that was looking at specifically how the negative sea ice anomalies during the winter of 2023 might impact storminess in the Southern Ocean. And so they found that there was an increase in storminess in the Southern Ocean due to these negative sea ice anomalies during the winter of 2023. And so we were kind of interested in contributing to this body of work by looking at, again, how does Antarctic sea ice loss impact the local atmospheric circulation and observational data? And then also, of course, we do compare it to modeled relationships to kind of, there are observational biases, there are model biases, and I think it's helpful to kind of use both sets of data and to compare them to one another to see what the relationships look like. And so for observational data, it's very similar to the previous project, mixture of satellite and reanalysis data. It's all covering the same period. And our general kind of analysis method is, again, it's a regression analysis, but now we're looking at kind of a grid point by grid point regression analysis. And so for this work, we were looking at, so a lot of the previous studies have kind of looked at the relationships in model output or spatial averages. And so we were interested in looking at it at a grid point level scale to kind of explore maybe the regionality of the relationships a bit more. And so, for example, this plot here of the regression of turbulent heat flux onto sea ice loss is basically just a map of turbulent heat fluxes regressed onto a map of sea ice concentration. And so basically, when you regress them like that, you're treating each grid point individually, and that allows you to kind of look at the regionality a bit more and also see how consistent the relationships are, I guess, across the sea ice pack. And that this regression here, and it's going to be consistent across the regressions you'll see, is we're always going to be regressing onto inverted sea ice concentration or sea ice loss. And that's simply just because we found it an easier way to see what is the resulting impact on turbulent heat fluxes from sea ice loss, just simply a sign difference. And so we start by just looking at simply the regression of sea ice concentration onto itself. This just gives a sense of what the kind of internal variability of sea ice concentration looks like. This is first across all months. And so we see that there's quite a lot of variability as to be expected from the very large seasonal cycle, but it's still nice nonetheless to kind of see where the variability is most apparent. And then next, we regress turbulent heat flux, precipitation rate, and cloud fraction all onto sea ice loss. And so this is again across all months. And what we see is, given sea ice loss, we see a very widespread increases in turbulent heat flux, precipitation, and clouds, given this sea ice loss. And especially, this isn't maybe totally unexpected, because given sea ice loss, you'd expect, again, that increase in heat coming from the ocean into the atmosphere. It could lead to more vertical motion and increased in precipitation and cloud fraction. But I think you can see there's some regionality to the response, but also it's just a very widespread and very kind of builds confidence, since all these grid points are treated individually, kind of builds confidence in how strong and robust of the response this is. And so that's just exactly what I just said. And so, but as I mentioned, of course, the seasonal cycle of Antarctic sea ice is very large. And so it seems a bit unfair to kind of look at the results in an all months framework. And so we now wanted to look at kind of similar regressions, but this time splitting it up based on the seasonal cycle of sea ice. And so we kind of split up the year into 4 seasons here just based on the sea ice seasonal cycle. So a sea ice minimum season, a growth season, a maximum season, and a melting season. And we can first start out and look at just simply what the variability of sea ice is for each of these 4 seasons. So this is, again, just kind of ends up being the standard deviation of sea ice. And we see the most variability occurs during the sea ice pack and then contracts as the sea ice melts into the summer. And you see more kind of widespread variability during the melting season and the growth season, as that's when the most change in the sea ice pack is occurring. And so now you can regress turbulent heat fluxes onto sea ice as we've done before, but this time now broken up by season. And now you see that there's quite a widespread increase in turbulent heat flux, but that's mainly occurs during the winter, that there's a much smaller, kind of almost negligible response in the summer at times. And this can be partially explained by simply just that the temperature differential between the ocean and the atmosphere is much bigger in the winter and much smaller in the summer. And so when you remove that sea ice, you have a lot more heat going from the ocean into the atmosphere in the winter than you do in the summer. But I think it's still quite noticeable how big of a difference that means that the impact of sea ice loss has on the resulting turbulent heat fluxes. And we can expand this and do again the regressions of precipitation and cloud fraction onto sea ice concentration. And we see again widespread increases in precipitation clouds as a result of sea ice loss, with this the main impacts occurring during winter and much smaller impacts occurring during the summer. And I think that this is we see widespread agreement with this. We see some regionalities, which is interesting, especially maybe you see a bit more over areas of East Antarctica or maybe the Antarctic Peninsula, but it is a relatively widespread response, and that the fact that the most impacts are occurring during winter kind of highlight that, especially as we're getting more winter sea ice anomalies, that those winter sea ice anomalies in particular have the power to impact the atmosphere more than some of the sea ice anomalies during the summer. And so I guess for the rest of kind of the results I'm going to show, we're going to kind of focus on just this one season here, just so we don't end up looking at a bunch of plots with tiny little panels. But I'm happy to show you the full seasonal plots later if you're interested. But generally, the seasonality of results kind of generally holds as is expected from this panel here. And so that's kind of the observational results we were looking at. And as I mentioned, we wanted to look at how these relationships compare to the relationships that we could see in models. And so we used 2 atmosphere-only experiments run on CAM6. So the first one is the transient sea ice experiment, which is kind of detailed in that top row there. And so this is an atmosphere-only experiment that's forced by observational sea ice concentration time series from HAT-ISST. The SST's forcings are a seasonal cycle of sea surface temperatures that are based on just a climatology. And then the resulting output is monthly output from 1979 until 2019. And so this resulting output is very similar, of course, in structure to our observationally constrained data. And so we can perform similar regressions on this data, but now we're able to isolate just what the impacts of this observational sea ice time series is on the atmosphere. And then the second set of experiments we used are these PAMIP style experiments. And so these are atmosphere-only experiments that are forced with just a seasonal cycle of sea ice from 2 different states. So there's a pre-industrial sea ice experiment, which is forced with sea ice when the global mean temperature was 13.67 degrees, which is representative of pre-industrial times. And then there's a future sea ice experiment that's forced with sea ice that's a seasonal cycle of sea ice when global mean temperature would be 15.67 degrees, which again, in a future state. And so both of these are forced with the same SST forcing, and then you have monthly output for 1 year. And so what's particularly useful is that if you take the difference between these 2 simulations, you can isolate the impact of Antarctic sea ice change between the pre-industrial and future periods on the atmosphere. And so it's a little bit of a different output than the transient sea ice transient sea ice experiments, and it kind of allows you to look at a slightly different question. And so first we look at the transient sea ice experiments, and we do the same regressions as we did for the observational results. Now I'm only showing one season, but as I mentioned, the seasonality is very similar. And I'd show you the winter season because that's when the largest largest impacts are. And so what we see is that we have given sea ice loss in the transient sea ice experiments, we see increases in turbulent heat flux, precipitation, and clouds. They all have very widespread increases. Precipitation rate, I think, is a little bit smaller than what we saw in observation, which is interesting, but we see relatively, I think, comparable increases in all three of these given sea ice loss. And so this kind of highlights that this regression technique can provide at least a pretty good, accurate observational estimate how changes in sea ice may impact kind of these regional atmospheric conditions, and that given that it's only regression analysis, it can still provide some interesting information about what these relationships look like in the observations that we have. And so then if we look at the PMIP style experiments, we can see that, so first we look at simply what the sea ice difference is between these two simulations. And so this is just simply where the sea ice melt occurred, where the sea ice difference is between the future and pre-industrial simulations. And then we can look at the difference between these two simulations of these three variables again. And what we see is that given the sea ice loss between the two simulations, there's also a corresponding increase in turbulent heat flux, precipitation, and cloud fraction. Now it's not quite as widespread because we're again looking at a difference between the two. It's not a regression, and so it's not expecting it to be the same. We're actually capturing not only these local relationships that we were capturing in the regressions, but we're also capturing how maybe changes in the large-scale circulation could be impacting these, or other impacts that might be happening, other mechanisms that might be happening that aren't the local relationships. And we can see that there's kind of a couple areas that really pop out. There's kind of an area in the Weddell Sea or the Indian Ocean sector, and then there's also an area in the Amundsen-Bellinghausen seas that kind of have the most increase in these three variables given sea ice loss. And so we next kind of wanted to investigate how much of these impacts could be, at least in the future, the difference between the future and pre-industrial runs could be attributable to these local relationships that we were kind of isolating in our previous results. And to do that, we start with a regression of precipitation onto sea ice from the transient simulations. Now, it looks a bit messier than before, and that's just because the units are a little bit different, but it's the same where we get this increase in precipitation given sea ice loss, and that's representative of how the local relationships are working. We can multiply that by the change in sea ice between the future and pre-industrial PMIP style simulations. And then what we get is the change in precipitation rate between these future and pre-industrial simulations that would be due to just the local relationships that we were isolating in those regressions. And so what we see is, especially in kind of the Weddell and the Indian Ocean sector, we see that clearly quite a bit of the precipitation response can be attributable to these local relationships. And if we look at more of kind of the residuals, so we start with the full precipitation difference between these two simulations. We subtract the piece due to the local relationships. And then this is the residual that would not be due to the local relationships that would be due to other ways that sea ice could impact precipitation. And so there's still some left, obviously. There's still some left in the Indian Ocean and over in the Amundsen-Bellinghausen Sea area. And so what are other ways that, what could this be explained by? So we kind of talked about these local relationships where you can have sea ice loss, which increases local turbulent heat flux and increases local vertical motion and precipitation. Sea ice loss can also increase downwind horizontal convergence by mixing free tropospheric winds down to the surface. That's when I'm showing this little diagram below is given sea ice loss, you have that increase in turbulent heat flux, mix those faster free tropospheric winds down to the surface, which then would increase near surface wind speeds and could result in increased horizontal convergence and precipitation downwind. And then we also have sea ice loss can impact changes in baroclinicity. So it could change near surface temperature gradients, changes atmospheric baroclinicity, which could result in an equatorward shift of storm tracks and precipitation. And so we didn't directly look at 3, we looked at 2 a little bit. And I'm not going to show the plots today just for the sake of time, but we did see that we saw an increase in near surface wind speeds that wasn't just necessarily due to the reduction in sea ice. And so that indicates that the second mechanism could be actually at play and could be explaining some of those residual differences. And so if we go back to this kind of figure here that was showing the amount due to local relationships in the center there and the residual remaining, we also see that I think the remaining precipitation response there difference is actually a little bit downwind of where this sea ice loss was occurring, which also indicates that could be kind of pointing to the second mechanism there that could be explaining some of these precipitation differences because it would be by the nature of it, the precipitation response would be downwind where the sea ice loss was occurring. And so I guess kind of just to wrap up that second part there, and so we've kind of looked at the relationships in observationally constrained data of showing how these strong relationships between sea ice loss and turbulent heat flux, precipitation, and cloud fraction. We've seen that these relationships are also present in modeled experiments that are forced by sea ice, which kind of highlights that this regression analysis is able to kind of parse out what these local relationships are and kind of has good agreement, and that these local relationships with sea ice can actually explain a large portion of the predicted precipitation changes. And it highlights that, again, these sea ice anomalies occurring in the winter have the power to have a lot more impact on the local atmosphere than maybe the sea ice anomalies in the summer. And that as we see more, if we see more of those, and as we have seen in the last couple of years, it would be expected to then see more changes in the atmosphere going forward. And so I'm going to bring it back to this kind of schematic here, but now I've replaced the titles with just a couple simpler bullet points here from each of the different parts. So the first part is out in a paper that came out last fall. That's a QR code for the paper there if you're interested about more details. The second part should be submitted relatively soon, so keep an eye out for preprint there. And I would love to take any questions. And I'm just going to exit out so I can see all of your faces because I couldn't see anybody while I was presenting.
Awesome job, Chloe. Thank you for this amazing presentation. And yeah, like Chloe said, we can open the floor for questions. And I see Dave is in the room, our resident sea ice organizing expert.
Resident sea ice expert, but really struggles with time zones.
Muted, Alan.
So I'll preface this with saying I'm not a sea ice person, so I don't know if this is a dumb question or not. Chloe, you were presenting these processes in the Antarctic context, but you started, contrasting kind of Arctic and Antarctic sea ice. I'm curious how much you think these processes, or is there anything that you could transfer to understanding of Arctic sea ice change, or is it just such a different system that we're talking about entirely different things? Like I understand the circulation patterns are quite different, but yeah, or any of the processes, relative amounts of processes leading to variability in the Antarctic, is that going to be important to understand the Arctic as well?
I think there are definitely similarities, at least, certainly from, I guess, as you said, obviously the circulation patterns are different. But I think that there are general kind of through lines of how changes in kind of the wind patterns and precipitation can impact and pressure patterns can impact sea ice in the Arctic as well. And it's certainly at least for the second part of the project too, of how can the sea ice loss impact atmospheric circulation. There's certainly been some of the results I showed have also been shown to be those relationships have also been shown to be true in the Arctic. And so I think although they're quite different, there also are a lot of similarities, and they can be useful to it's interesting to compare what aspects are similar and what aspects are a little bit different.
Thanks.
We have Inga. You have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Chloe. That was a great seminar. There was so much packed in there. I'm not sure I've got everything. So, and I do see ice, but not necessarily these aspects. So I was wondering if you could go back to slide 54. There was a lot going on in that. I was just wanting to make sure I understood
Yeah,
some of the regional behavior.
absolutely.
Yep,
This one?
cool.
Yeah.
Yep, that's great. So yeah, so I was wondering about the difference between the sort of regionality of those different aspects. So the turbulent heat flux, like you said, the Amundsen-Bellinghausen Sea and the northern bit of the Weddell Sea. But then when you get to the cloud fraction, it's much more the Ross Sea rather than the
Yes.
Amundsen-Bellinghausen Sea. I wondered if you had a physical explanation for why that would be
So
different.
it's a really good question. Yeah, I haven't admittedly looked too much into trying to explore specifically the regionalities, but I think that yeah, so I unfortunately don't have a great answer for you, but I think it's really interesting how these couple of regions really pop out, and I think that's definitely kind of unfortunately currently just a kind of future area that I want to look into. I haven't I don't know, yeah, I haven't looked into it as of now yet, but I think it's really the regionalities of these I think are really interesting.
Yeah, no, I think because that jumped out at me, I was like, turbulent heat flux,
Yeah,
yes, and more precipitation, yes. And then I'm like, but hang on, it's not the clouds. So you'd think the precipitation would be coming from the clouds. So yeah. Was that the case in
absolutely.
the other months as well? So was there that kind of
I,
shift?
Yes, and I can quickly see if I have. I think, but it generally those that regionality did hold for at least for the other like winter for like the sea ice growth season that kind of I defined. The same regionalities held, and for the it was just generally less of a response in the summer, which was consistent. So it was a bit more muddled, but at least for the sea ice growth season, yeah, that was consistent. Which is it's interesting. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, Michael?
Thank you for your talk. I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it, but is the Southern annual mode expected to like become more anonymously positive or negative? And like how might that impact sea ice going forward? Like will we continue seeing this drop off as we see
No, it's
more extreme phases?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. There's been a positive trend in the SAM during the summer months. There, at least as of yet, hasn't been a necessarily very significant trend in the kind of the winter season. But I think it's notable that at least in I'm just going to go back to, I think, at least in the time series, I think that you can see that the SAM experienced some very unprecedented kind of anomalies over the last decade. And I think, at least this is just showing September, but I think we saw some in other months as well. And so I think this indicates that maybe that the SAM is experiencing some more variability and more anomalies. And I don't have a good understanding. I don't know if this is a particularly answered question about why maybe the SAM is experiencing more variability. I think that's still, but it does seem like maybe over the last decade that there also has been some kind of extreme or like anomalously high variability within the SAM, which I think is interesting. Whether or not, that will continue, and whether that's indicative of, a different change that it's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we have lots of questions popping up. This is amazing. I think Pat's hand was raised first, so I'll let
Oh,
Pat go.
thank you. Just that was fantastic, Chloe. Um, just in relation to this picture that's up in front of us, there's a very obvious discrepancy between the SAM and the September sea ice anomalies um, in recent years. Any ideas?
Yeah, no, yeah. I don't have a perfectly solid answer. I think my kind of where my thinking is at about this. I've thought a lot about this, and what I'm thinking is that I think that it's since obviously this relationship is only one factor that's influencing sea ice, that like especially the impacts in the ocean are going to able to carry more weight kind of as it, like for example, like the ocean heat content builds and is able to like maybe persist these low sea ice anomalies, that even if the SAM switches to a negative, switches its phase, that it is able to kind of maybe initiate some of these, but it maybe doesn't have as much weight from just 1 year or 1 month of a particularly strong anomaly as maybe a kind of we're starting to build up now maybe in the ocean. And so that's kind of at least where my head is at about maybe why there's this discrepancy, but I don't have like a particularly I don't have a particularly solid answer. I think it's really interesting. I'm curious what the relationship continues to look like moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Looks like is it Marilyn?
Yes, it is. Chloe, thank you for a really that was a really nice talk. I got I got your paper and I'm gonna have to go read it again. I'm now more excited to read it. But the question I have also concerns this diagram, comes from this diagram, and it popped into my head when you put it up earlier. There is, as you noted, a really strong correspondence between the two indices that you have from 2014 onwards. And I'm looking at the correlations. The correlations for a data set of that length are quite high. Usually expect something like 33 or 0.33 or something like that. And that's significant. I was wondering if along with the sea ice, the SAM changed, and along with a change in the SAM, if the relationship between them changed. So like as a first pass, I was just wondering what that correlation might be if you stopped in 2014 or approximately where that is. And would it be different from the other? You know what I'm saying?
No, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that, and then and what does it look like just for the last 8, 10 years or thereabouts, however much we have, where we have that change, and then to go on from there. Did you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I have. So I don't think I have it with, but I have, so I made kind of, not of this plot, but of some of the other figures from this project from just basically the period from 1979 until 2015 to kind of see what just the relationship looked like during that period. And you did see the seasonality, but it definitely was weaker than if you consider the full period or if you just consider the last 10 years. And so I think that whether or not the relationship has changed, or if simply this also happened, the last 10 years is also when the SAM experienced these large anomalies. And so whether that is just the relationship is kind of popping out because the SAM experienced particularly anomalous phases. I'm not totally sure, but I think it's definitely interesting that it's a much stronger relationship in the last 10 years than the previous like 30 years or so. And I think that actually somebody else in the group that I'm now a part of at Obvi is kind of looking at this relationship more in models and looking at maybe a more future projections. And I think that will be useful to kind of unpack a more mechanistic understanding of what this relationship is, to try to, because I think that's, I think we need to think about that more. And because I think that's a really important, question.
Good.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to see what they find. Thank you.
Yeah.